Dzień dobry, game da sada. I'm afraid that's the extent of my Polish, but I'm here to speak to you about what I understand to be the energy policy of Poland through to 2030, and to share with you some of the experiences which I have, not only as the Vice President of Globe International and Globe Europe, but also as a legislator in the UK Parliament, in the House of Commons on the Energy Select Committee there. Now, I know that you've set out a long-term framework for your energy policy, and that, of course, is an absolutely sensible and right thing to be doing, and complies with the EU directive. One of the things that I see is that the members of the Parliament in the Sejm have been very keen to engage with that, and I think one of the areas in which Poland can look to in discussing this framework is to see what has been going on in other countries and to see if they can learn from the mistakes that countries like the UK have made in our own energy policy. So I'll present to you some of the failures that we have done rather than the successes simply, because I hope that it's also in looking at the things that we have got wrong that you will be able to construct your energy policy into the future on much better lines. I think probably the first thing to say is that a long-term perspective here is absolutely critical. And we have found that although you can enter into support for renewables in a way that gives a high reward, a high incentive at the beginning, that is really much less valuable than certainty over time. What business clearly want is certainty. And if they feel that the rates of return for investing in renewables are unreasonably high, then very often they have no confidence that those rates are going to be maintained into the future. They fear that government, or even a new government after an election, will come in and change the situation. And as a result of that, they will lose the certainty that they need to ensure that they have the rate of return on the investment that they have put into a particular project. Now, we experienced this to our great detriment in the solar feed-in tariffs that we put in place in the UK. And of course, Spain similarly has experienced problems with its own solar feed-in, solar PV photovoltaic tariffs. And one of the things that I really would impress upon you, I know you're using green certificates rather than the feed-in tariff that much of the rest of the Europe has adopted. But one of the things that I really would impress upon you is the importance of maintaining support at a constant level and giving business that certainty going forward. We've certainly found that when we failed to do that, business has been very angry with government, and they've complained that the jobs and the skills and the training that they were giving to people to be able to invest in the infrastructure of the future was just being snatched away. If I turn to the various policy instruments that we've used to support renewable electricity in the UK, you will see, I think, that the decisions on the design of those instruments has been taken in the framework of broader planning decisions on our low carbon ambition. We see it very much in terms of an ambition that is set out in law through to 2050, where we have given our target, which is to reduce our carbon emissions by at least 80% by 2050. And on the way to doing that, we have set various benchmarks. And of course, we've incorporated that in the framework of the Climate Change Committee, which is an independent committee that reports to government and sets carbon budgets. Now these budgets are really tremendously important, because what they do is they set out the framework which will enable us to deliver various benchmarks on the road to 2050. And critically, if you look at some of the budgets that they have set for us, they have said that we should be aiming for a decarbonisation of our electricity market by 2030, so that the grams per kilowatt hour of electricity production in 2030 are reduced to between 40 and 60 grams per kilowatt hour. Now that's an extraordinarily difficult target to reach, as I'm sure many of you will be aware, when we're talking about coal, which of course is of critical importance, not just to Poland, but to many, many other countries. We see levels that are way in excess of 600 grams per kilowatt hour from coal production that is unabated. So gas, we're still looking at around 400, 380 or 400 with gas. And it really is going to be a very, very difficult thing for the UK to reduce its emissions level per kilowatt hour to 40 to 60, between 40 and 60 grams by 2030. But we know we have to do this. And in order to do that, we've tried to set in place various incentives to both encourage renewables into the market, to create that incentive for companies to invest in renewable technologies, but also to put in obligations on existing suppliers that a proportion of their own supply must be from renewable sources. So in 2002 it was that we introduced the renewable obligation into the UK law. And that is currently our main market-based mechanism for supporting large-scale generation of renewable electricity. Now, since its reduction, the renewable obligation has been subject to a number of different reforms. It works, though, by placing an obligation on licensed electricity suppliers to source a specified and annually increasing proportion of their electricity sales from renewable sources. And if they don't do that, of course, they have to pay a penalty. Now, on the 1st of April 2009, the reforms introduced mean that new generators joining the renewable obligations now receive different numbers of renewable obligations certificates, depending on their costs and their potential for large-scale deployment. So these new renewable technologies are able to produce their electricity, of course, without the carbon emissions, and they can sell those certificates to the fossil fuel producers who need them to meet their own supply limits. In 2004, the Energy Act that we introduced became an important part of the framework for the development of offshore wind, and of course also for other marine renewable technologies within our territorial waters and indeed outside them. You will know that simply by accident of geography, the UK at the end of the Atlantic is battered by wind and waves, and so we are peculiarly well placed to take advantage of offshore wind and indeed of tidal and wave technologies. So we have experimental testing grounds both in the far north of Scotland but also down south on the southwest coast of England, where these technologies are currently in development, and we hope that they will provide new incentives for suppliers to go into renewable technologies of wave and tidal power. And we believe that these can be a very significant proportion of our own electricity production in the future. Now, the Act implemented a range of commitments made in 2003, in fact, in the proposals that were put out by government then in the Energy White Paper, and those related to energy efficiency. And of course, this is an equally important part of the work that we are doing in trying to make sure that we reduce our CO2 emissions. Energy efficiency is absolutely foremost in any package of measures. And we've done this through looking at building standards to try and make sure that our buildings are properly insulated. It's quite ridiculous. In fact, many people find it incredible that a country like Finland, with the snow and the winters that they have, actually have a lower proportion of excess deaths each winter than we do in the UK, or even that they do in Spain. Spain is one of the countries with the highest proportion of excess winter deaths, because of course the design in Spain is for the hot summers, but when they do have a cold winter, then very often the buildings are not able to keep people warm enough to survive that winter well. And building standards are absolutely critical in this, but so are product standards, making sure that products make best use of energy and that we reduce our overall energy consumption. So we then come to 2008 and what was then really a groundbreaking piece of legislation, and I say that not simply within the UK, but I believe it's right and fair to say that this was groundbreaking across the world, because the Energy Act in 2008 set in place this first legal binding obligation upon government to meet this commitment of at least 80% reduction in our CO2 emissions over and above 1990 levels by 2050. And it had an obligation also to increase the diversity of the UK's energy mix. The other thing that Act did was it created the renewable heat incentive. And that allowed the Secretary of State to establish a financial support mechanism for renewable heat generated anywhere, both on a commercial scale, in business or large industrial sites, but also in domestic properties, looking at local heating schemes, local communities, local hospitals, or schools. So again, looking at renewable heat incentive as a way of reducing our demand for fossil fuels and our emissions and getting that CO2 level down. Now, the Act created regulation that enables private sector investment in carbon capture and storage projects as well. And the 2010 Act that we introduced complements those measures by including provisions on introducing a new CCS incentive, a carbon capture and storage incentive, to support the construction. At that stage, it was of 4 commercial scale CCS demonstrator projects. Now, unfortunately, that commitment to 4 did not survive the incoming government, and that commitment has been reduced. But the money is still there for at least 1 CCS demonstrator project. And of course, carbon capture and storage is important, as I said before, not just for countries like the UK and Poland that have a heavy base load of coal. We do not account for the major impact on the world's climate at the moment. But if one looks to India and China and see the amount of coal that is being burnt there, then I think we understand the importance of carbon capture and storage technology. It's not to reduce the relatively modest amounts of coal that we consume and use within the European Union. Of course, it is absolutely valuable that we have CCS to reduce the emissions from coal in Europe, and that will help us to achieve our own objectives. But on a global scale, CCS is much more important when one considers the use of coal in emerging economies and the developing world. There, if we do not provide a CCS solution, then I think no matter what we do, the world will still be in deep, deep trouble. because of the use of coal in those countries. So it's vital that we take ahead this technology. That's why we have put funding there. That funding is now set aside in government, available for those demonstrator projects. And again, we see this as part of our long-term commitment that we have legislated for. Let me say a little bit about the renewables energy strategy that we produced in 2009. This outlined how the UK would meet its legally binding target to produce 15% of all our energy from renewable sources by 2020. And of course, that's not just in the generating sector, it's also in transport, which of course is another major user of fossil fuels. And the strategy created an Office of Renewable Energy Deployment within our Department of Energy and Climate Change. And their job was really to take forward this strategy and those commitments. And the strategy comprised 3 primary 2020 targets and introduces payment schemes to support the production of renewable heat and small-scale clean electricity generation by households, micro-generation, as well as industry, businesses and communities. So from 2010, the UK government offers feed-in tariffs for small-scale, low-carbon electricity produced from a variety of renewable sources. Now, I should stress here that microgeneration has been particularly important. Not for the overall contribution that it makes to our emissions targets, but for enabling real public understanding of this issue. And one of the best ways that we have found to make sure that the public understand issues of energy consumption, climate change impact, emissions of CO2, and cost reduction in their own fuel bills is where this microgeneration has been put in place. People become much more conscious of both the costs of their energy and of course for the benefits that they are due to receive as a result of their own electricity generation. I know for sure that since I put solar panels on my own roof, I am much more conscious that every light that is left on in my house is stopping me exporting more electricity to the grid because I'm using it myself, and therefore I'm not getting the benefit of the tariff that I would get if I exported it to the grid. So I'm now very conscious of the energy usage in my own house. I like to think that I was conscious before I put the solar panels in place, but I'm pretty sure I'm a lot more conscious of it now. And this is a way in which people have really embraced the renewables industry and begin to see the impact that it can have on our lives. And we think this is tremendously important, that this should be rolled out, that it should be incentivized. But again, I refer to that warning which I gave at the beginning of my remarks, which set out the importance of a long-term stable framework, rather than simply giving a high return at the beginning to encourage people to move into this area, but then cutting off the support in a way which leaves people feeling that their investment has not been justified. It really is important that there is stability here, that those manufacturers that are producing solar PV or wind or other forms of renewable technologies such as heat pumps can see that there is stability in this market so that they can train their staff accordingly, that they can build up their businesses gradually with certainty about the rate of return that they're going to get on their investment. Now, we have also put in place several incentives to promote the production of biofuels, and we have a bioenergy capital grant scheme that supports biomass fueled heat and also combined heat and power projects in industrial and commercial and community sectors in England. We've had 6 rounds of funding provided since the scheme was launched there. hope I'm back with you. The screen cut out there for a minute, but I think everything is okay now. I was talking about the Bioenergy Capital Grant Scheme. We have reduced the excise duty rate that was introduced for biodiesel and for unleaded petrol. Again, trying to incentivize suppliers to make sure that a proportion of all that they sell is from renewable sources. And it is critical that we don't look at emissions simply from the point of view of generation and the power sector, but that we also tackle the very substantial impact that our transport sector has. Now, because this long-term perspective is so important, I think the transposition of the directive in Poland and your framework that's setting this out through till 2030 is really very important indeed. And I understand that next year the Polish government will submit to the Sejm a draft energy law and a national programme of low-emission economy. That, I think, is a tremendously positive move. I look forward to seeing the ways in which you take this forward. I hope that you're able to look across to other colleagues in Europe and other jurisdictions in Europe where we have made mistakes that you can learn from in drafting and framing your own legislation. As I say, in 2008 in the UK, we did this. We set out our case for decarbonisation. We adopted targets for CO2 emission reductions up to 2050, and this has been a tremendously important element in giving that certainty to business that they really do need. At the moment, the UK is in a very critical point of its own future. We have today seen the publication of the energy bill. When you are watching this will be last Friday that the UK announced its energy bill proposals. And we are maintaining our support for renewables through to 2020. Our Chancellor and our Energy Department, you may know we're in a coalition government, they've been fighting a very considerable battle here over whether the targets to 2030 would be maintained. Now, they have not agreed on that, and those targets from the Chancellor, from the Finance Department of Government, are being set to one side at the moment. I am a member of the opposition party, the Labour Party in the UK, and I have simply proposed today that what we should be doing here is we should be ensuring that the business community, in particular the gas sector, which the Finance Department wants to incentivise but then lock in for 40 years of production in the UK, gets a very clear understanding from Her Majesty's official opposition, which is what the Labour Party in the UK is, that when we come into government, we will legislate to introduce an emissions performance standard that is set lower than unabated gas can produce. And therefore there will be a penalty for gas-fired production that is looking to provide baseload supply, so that it would not be economical to build too many gas-fired power stations. And at the same time, because we will need gas, gas will be an essential element, an essential component of the UK's mix of fuels going forward. We will need it in order to cope with the spikes in demand from renewables, where demand does not always meet supply. It's an intermittent power source, of course, whether one's talking about tidal power or wave power or wind power or even solar power. All of these are to some extent intermittent, and therefore they have to be evened out by the capacity that gas provides to cope with that flexibility of demand. So we would incentivize that, I hope, by putting in place a high price for intermittent gas supply. That will ensure that investors know that it is sensible to invest in 3 or 4 power stations which we might need for that intermittent supply, and they will be able to get their return on capital from the market from that high tariff that we would give, but that it would be a foolish investment simply to swamp the market with new gas-fired power because there would not be the ability to meet the revised emissions performance standards that we would set. So there's a big debate, a very big debate going on in the UK. But I think above all, the one thing that I would say to you that we have learned is that giving investors, giving business confidence about what the future looks like is the best way to ensure that there is a clear incentive to invest in what is really the most important infrastructure for all our countries and all our economies. It's been a pleasure talking with you. I hope that some of the things that I've said may prove helpful to your own discussions. Of course, Globe chapters all across Europe wish you well in Poland in your own deliberations. And certainly if I can provide any further information and aid you further in the work that you have ahead of you, I'd be only too pleased to do so. Thank you for listening.